I hope that you can hear me online. Right, so warmly welcome to Linköping University and the Department of Thematic Studies and Tema Technology and Social Change. To all of you here in the room, but also to you joining online. My name is Karin Edberg and I work here. We're here today for the second occasion of the lecture series Planning in Transition that have a special focus on sustainable mobilities this year. And we have had a number of distinguished guests in the series this year earlier, like, for instance, Nicola Sperling, Anna Nikoleva, Greg Marston, and Mimi Scheller, and among others that you also can see online following the link on the homepage that I think that you already seen. Next up on, when is it again? October 2nd is Lela Rekishvili. But today I want to welcome Peter Cox, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Chester in the UK. And Peter is currently a visiting scholar here at Tema T, and we're really happy to have you here. Peter has been working on social change, social movements, philosophy of science, among other things, and not the least in relation to mobility and to cycling then in particular, on which he has also written a number of books and articles, among others, Cycling and Sociology of Velomobility, and forthcoming Anthropocene Mobilities, Walking, Cycling, and Caring for the Commons, that we look forward reading soon. In his talk, Peter will focus on cycling and degrowth, and I hope also on the politics of cycling. Peter will talk for about 1 hour, and then we will have time for questions and conversations. And you that are joining here with us are also welcome for some refreshments and also joining to go maybe to a restaurant afterwards. And you at home make sure to have that on your own. And online you are welcome to post questions in the chat or raise your hand and we will take care of them after Peter's lecture. With not further ado, I welcome Peter up to the stage.
Thank you very much. Right. So, cycling towards degrowth is the theme of this. And what I want to do is really bring these two ideas together to develop a political analysis of cycle travel, to ask what might be required to think about mobility through the lens of human-scaled travel and to provide a critique of automobility, rather than just simply look at how more cycling can be inserted into what I would call a fundamentally unchallenged regime of automobility. Because cycling's role in sustainable mobility transitions is often framed as one of getting more people to cycle more often and of seeking to identify which journeys by car can be replaced and ensuring that they are replaced. But sadly, this fails to tackle the underlying problem of the supportive relationship of transport planning, including much sustainable mobility planning, it must be said, to the reproduction of high carbon, high energy economic systems. To put it bluntly, we who are the beneficiaries and practitioners of current high energy transport systems, especially those dependent on fossil fuels, will need to go beyond the sustainable mobility model and to consider post-growth and degrowth ideas. I'll explain a little bit further on. This just doesn't mean just less or slower travel, though both are quite useful. But as being frequently noted in relation to degrowth economics, degrowth in a growth-oriented system is just recession. Degrowth economics calls for structural changes that shift the dependency on growth. Likewise, degrowth mobilities challenge the expansionist models of mobility and their intimate entanglement with growth economics. So a further problem as we begin to conceptualize transitions towards degrowth is that to do so requires us to interrogate the models of change that we use, the assumptions that underlie the change processes that we're promoting. Taking degrowth challenges seriously requires us to consider how our understanding of change happens and how we can describe change. And because those models that we use to describe where we want to go and how we want to get there can unwittingly contribute to further reinforcing and normalizing growth beyond a threshold of sufficiency. And I'm not trying to pose cycling here as a world savior or anything. Although it's an inescapable necessity in planning and designing more sustainable transport scenarios, I'm not really talking either about the everyday practices of cycling today, although that's a bit of a surprise for anybody who knows my work at all. Instead, I'm trying to pull out, as I said, this political analysis of cycling. And that's something that doesn't just appear from riding a bike. It's not an automatic corollary, but reflection on the experiences of riding, critical reflection on the experiences of riding may provide the basis for deliberate political constructions. Reliance on travel at a human speed can shape perspectives on the world. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the latter parts of this. I'm suggesting that we use critical reflection on travel by human power as a basis to think about the shape and direction of change, hence the degrowth. And to describe this change thinking, I'll be using the language of vélomobilities. Two major reasons for this. First, to indicate a contrast and a critique of the current dominance of a system of automobility, and as described by John Urry nearly 20 years ago, and its entanglement with the reproduction of capital. To talk about vélomobilities is to describe a political project, one that doesn't do away with motorized road, rail, and air travel, but breaks its systemic hold on mobility imaginations. In other words, how the aim of much sustainable mobility planning is to replicate existing mobility relations in a low or zero carbon form. If vélomobility was only a critique of automobility, we might find many names for this mobility project. But the second reason to use this term is to highlight how the analysis has arisen from the collective explorations of those who've been thinking about the implications of cycling practices, of policies, and of promotion over its long history against a background of automobile hegemony. Velomobility is not just slow travel, but a way of thinking about mobilities and their relation to carbon capitalism and to a series of entanglements implied by dependence on high energy mobilities. So the first point is to catch up with where we are. The scale of the problem seems often overwhelming. And the bad news is, of course, that there's no easy techno fix. If we take the report seriously, we can see there's no return to business as normal. Substantial permanent transformations are required. We'll have to keep adapting and changing. As mentioned, current sustainable mobility plans are dominated either by finding cleaner energy systems to power existing practices or by substituting journey modes. Both of these solutions remain grounded in assumptions that we need to maintain and keep going on current levels of mobility, or even to be able to increase them by increasing the efficiency of travel. These approaches don't challenge the scale of mobility of the globally hypermobile, or enable us, I don't think, to consider really seriously what mobility sufficiency might look like. That language of crisis that we've got used to suggests there's a problem we can get over, a momentary glitch that once we've worked out how to deal with it, everything can be restored to a default stable setting. But the Anthropocene designation indicates that we're moving from an era of relative climate stability into a situation characterized by unpredictability. The Anthropocene isn't an era of human triumph, but one that will require us to recognize the hubris of the assumptions that there aren't any limits to the possibilities of extraction and resource use, and of human ingenuity to dig ourselves out of the holes that we've created. So especially in the most carbon intensive economies, we will require transformations that address both existing patterns of energy use and the current trajectories of change. And among those causes is mobility's entanglement with the constant expansion of economic systems of production, exchange, and consumption. Hypermobility and economic growth beyond thresholds of sufficiency are symbiotic. In sum, there's a certain tragedy in the exploration of sustainable transport solutions. Anyone involved in this area for more than a short period of time rapidly becomes aware of the ambiguity of interventions over recent decades. On the one hand, we have much more efficient and non-fossil fueled vehicles, but the gains made have been almost entirely offset by increased distances travelled and higher vehicle weights, and the corollary of that in terms of the creation of pollution. So let's think about, for a moment about how cycling has been presented within this call for sustainable transport systems. Since the 1970s report of Vehicle for a Small Planet, cycling and environmental concern have been tied together as logical bedfellows. In the past 2 decades, cycling promotion and advocacy has been cleverly and almost seamlessly inserted into policy initiatives arising from obligations created by international commitment to sustainable development and to carbon reduction. And these have led to incredibly successful national and international policy making with strategic targets and manuals of best practice that set out replicable approaches to change. And just a note on the various illustrations, I've just simply taken book covers that I've been using of books and articles and elements that I've been using on the way. And one reason for the success of these initiatives is that they can easily be integrated into an unchanged politico-economic agenda. And for example, I've contributed in the course of my work to the documentation that shows how cycling leads to economic growth. My excuse, it's necessary to unlock investment. Surely that's better than doing nothing. We all have dirty hands in this business. But the tragedy is that such actions can serve to more firmly entrench the broader trajectory of cycling as a useful contribution to ever-increasing dependence on mobility systems that are ultimately problematic. If pushed to defend ourselves, the benefits of cycling are appended to other irrefutable social goods: sustainability, better health, urban livability, city competitiveness. But these are actually null values. Who would be against any one of those things? What null values do is to depoliticize the problem. As a deliberate move, this has strategic value. Firstly, it can ensure the survival of cycling, as an example of a null value, in hostile political environments. And second, it assures inclusion of cycling in more favorable political environments. Non-ideological framing in practical policy discussion allows cross-party support by depoliticizing the debates. But there are problems to this. Depoliticization of any issue creates a void. Because null values can be appended to anything, such issues belong to no one. They have no politics. They belong to no broader political vision. They're disconnected from wider visions of change. For cycling, this has meant severing linkage with other social concerns. This is particularly visible in relation to issues of social equality and inclusion. Hence, academics and activists consistently and constantly have to fight a whole series of rearguard actions on a range of issues, including gender, impairment, ethnic exclusions, gentrification, etc., to ensure that cycling interventions while they might improve things for someone on a bike, don't exacerbate other existing social inequalities. So a bigger question perhaps needs to be asked. What is it that we're trying to sustain? Put simply and vividly by Justin Spinney a couple of years ago, cycling, he says, has been weaponized for growth. And not only is this problematic from the ecological and economic perspective, it also sidelines other non-instrumental visions of the role that cycling might play. It degrades and devalues the idea of play, of just the ludic dimension of life. This is why I want to pick up the conversation about ideas between ideas about cycling and the politics of degrowth, which has been defined very succinctly by Legia Nelson as a way of decolonizing our growth imaginaries. So my first suggestion is now that it is now time to change the scenario, to shift the language to describe what it is that we're concerned with. Talking about degrowth in the lecture title places my own sympathies in clear sight. No problem with that. But I also want to note that this is not as simple as it appears, nor is the dichotomy between various terminologies of post-growth, degrowth, beyond growth as simple and as clear as it might appear. Although I'm entirely happy talking about degrowth here, and it's a language that works within this academic context, we, as those who are exploring this, have to be tactically astute. Political compromise and tactical considerations always remain. Who are you talking with? Few politicians will give degrowth the time of day, but post-growth is sometimes acceptable. In the EU, beyond growth has been legitimised by the commissioning of research papers and organised symposia. In the UK, its discussion identifies you as an extremist and a danger to society. So I'll still just use the language of sustainability. What does thinking beyond growth require us to do? Let's start with a simple image. Growth is a good thing up to a certain threshold. Beyond that threshold, where needs are met, it becomes a system for the enrichment of elites, the accumulation of surplus for the Marxist analysts. Or, as John Barry memorably pointed out to me from another source, unchecked growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. So I want to use degrowth as more than a slogan, explore its capacity as a mode of reasoning beyond simply economic explanations. And to do so, I want to take a further step to bring into vision one of the critical discourses from which degrowth slogans emerged, that of post-development. So I'm going to take you into a journey into ideas that are probably even less familiar than degrowth might have been. So where do we start here? Writing and speaking about degrowth emerged with a number of authors and activists who had been engaged in ideas of post-development. And for those not familiar with it, post-development arose in the 1990s out of disquiet over the experiences of international development intervention, which had been experienced as neocolonialism, a historical project commencing at the end of the 1940s that had incorporated post-colonial states into dependent states, destroyed local ways of living and survival mechanisms, subsumed diverse cultures into a global capitalism, whilst increasing the gap between the developed and the underdeveloped nations and between rich and poor within them, despite its avowed intention that that was what it was designed to eliminate. And notably here, if we're trying to link degrowth, post-development, cycling, we can see how someone like Ivan Illich was a key inspiration of post-development critique, but was also his description of convivial technologies, an idea of social speeds in transport, which has come back and is frequently cited in thinking about or trying to think differently about the dilemmas of contemporary transport issues. He's involved in both. So there is this bridge that's there, even though it's not spoken. And Di Maria and Qatari have a fantastic little phrase here that's to describe what this is all about. The post-development, an approach in which development is no longer the central organizing principle of social life. Let's also think about how that might be translated into degrowth, an approach in which growth is no longer the central organizing principle of social life. And that enables us to begin to take this linkage seriously. One of the things that contemporary writers today do, and this pluriverse book is a great free online opportunity just to dip into this material. They show how this post-development is related to other social imaginaries: post-capitalism, post or degrowth, post-patriarchy, anti-racism, decoloniality. So if we're looking at degrowth, it's one of a bundled set of affinities. And I'm not going to elaborate on this at the moment, except to note that if we're going to think about forging a radical politics of cycling beyond its promotion as a means to ensure the survival of an already problematic mode of mobility thinking, wedded to growth, we need to consider how degrowth or post-growth fits in with other critical discourses. Put simply, change is not something that can be taken in isolation. Thinking, cycling, and degrowth requires us to, behoves us to explore the links and interrelations of a number of critical discourses and a critical examination of our assumptions about change. And this is where I'm very grateful to the mobilities paradigm. In recent work, as you mentioned, I've been using the phrase Anthropocene Mobilities as a shorthand for thinking about the form and the scale of the changes required. And to talk of mobilities is to talk of far more than talking about travel. In Urry's original work and in its development by Mimi Scheller and plenty of others, the mobilities turn signified a paradigm shift in social science thinking. It indicated a move away from a long tradition of social statics, where one stable institution, for example, family or education or work, is acted upon by social forces to effect a shift to another form of the family, another form of that same institution. The classic linear analysis of change. A, worked on by a force, moves to a position B or is shifted. A mobilities perspective emphasizes instead the constantly shifting forms of social institutions and social relations. Linear models of change give way to complexity. And that has profound implications for making and enacting policy interventions. A mobilities perspective requires us to undertake systems analysis, to recognize wicked problems, to understand institutions as adaptive networks. It may seem obvious from one aspect, but the closer social scientific thinking comes to the policy arena, the more easily it gets forgotten, I observe. So applying a mobilities model to movement and to the travel of selves, goods, and services alerts us to how and to interrogate how the current mobility regime is constructed, and therefore how we might begin to deconstruct it. So we can return to one of Urry's original questions. How does automobility as the current hegemonic mobility system prevent us moving towards or even thinking seriously about mobility degrowth? A system of mobility or automobility is a system of mobility integral to carbon capitalism's relentless pursuit of growth. It concerns not just the car, but an entire system of relations that enables car travel. that list of Ari's famous 6 points a good starting analysis for us. It's the invisible mechanism of capital growth that breaks thresholds of mobility as a satisfier of needs. It's a means by which new needs are created. Automobility is an incredibly efficient tool for creating networked dependencies of capital exchange, whilst being, and slightly ironically, an incredibly inefficient means of actually moving people around. 180 horsepower for a 180 kilo load doesn't quite seem sensible to me. It served an incredibly important role further in privatizing fossil fuel dependence down to the individual person. It's entangled with every other transport mode, shaping how we perceive them. It can continue without internal combustion. An electric mobility scenario will still be high energy, high speed dependent. And it's because automobility shapes how we perceive other modes of transport. Car travel provides a normative baseline for thinking about how we move ourselves and the stuff we consume around, and for assumptions about how easy travel is or it should be, how instantly accessible it should be. These constant normative assessment modes, how independent of climatic conditions or of social interactions. Other modes of travel are best assessed as competitors. At best, they can be understood to complement driving, perhaps even to do some things that cars aren't very good at, for example, personal travel in very dense cities, hence the policy interventions that imagine cycling exclusively as an urban phenomenon. This dominance colonizes our imagination and makes it very, very difficult to think otherwise in other modes, in other ways of imagining what could be. Brandon Wisson used a memorable phrase to highlight the impacts of automobility when they describe car travel as an imperial mode of travel. They point out that the benefits accrue to a globally small user elite, whereas the costs are borne by all. They are offshored, both the environmental costs in resource use and pollution, but also the invisibility of the public subsidies that exist for exclusive motor infrastructures. It takes over public space at the same time as it renders its users immune to contact with other persons, and at the same time creating vulnerabilities for other travelers. In this colonization of imagination, in a laudable attempt to provide a counter-narrative to car travel, Gosling and colleagues calculate the European cost of motor subsidies as 500 billion euros per annum. Spending on cycling in their same 14 cost category measure gives a benefit of 24 billion. Investment in walking, 66 billion. But even this analysis is problematic because it demonstrates how movement is conceived in terms of its capacity to generate capital. It may be a very useful tool to convince policymakers of more efficient investment means, but it does, and to change on that basis, but it does little to stem the impetus for growth. The spatial effects of dependency are obvious, but they're also accompanied by psychological dependencies. I can't imagine life without my car. There's a frequent below-the-line comment in even some of the best discussions. What we also see here is that in any consideration of mobility, the politics and practices are intertwined. Yes, driving is a social practice that, by its current configuration, attracts users. But it exists as a performance within a regime of automobility in which that performance is raised to that of a desirable and aspirational norm. So in this relationship between the politics of mobilities and the practices of mobilities, I want to push a little step further to argue that mobilities have pedagogies. They teach us how to be in the world. The relation between practices and politics is not determinate, just as I mentioned, just being a cyclist, just being a driver, or both, doesn't create a politics of either or both. However, they're not disconnected, and especially when each performance exists as part of either a dominant or a subaltern mobility regime. So in addition to the power relations of mobility performances, we can also observe the physical embodied dimensions of these performances, how each different mode of travel brings us into varying modes of interaction with other persons and with the other than human world. And this is what the forthcoming book is about. Habitual practices sediment, they lay down and they reinforce our social relations and our understandings of the world and our places in it. The repeated daily performances of mundane interaction or non-interactions with others, of the vulnerability of walking and cycling, for example, to weather and other contingent effects, or conversely, of the apparent mastery of travel spaces and time brought about by driving, the enforced sociality of public transport. Each creates radically different familiarities and socialities. So we learn through our habits. Travel that necessitates non-encounter with others or with the world inoculates us from their impact upon us. We risk becoming travelers isolated from encounter with the environment, from other people, from the necessity to think and plan and wait. Time becomes non-precious. All the factors that are the opposite of practicing and taking care and developing an ethic of care, of course, depends on the forging of relationships with the other that is cared for. Care, it doesn't take place in a vacuum. It takes place only within a relationship. So what are the relationships that different mobilities teach us? Emphasizing cycling and degrowth together is a way to explore what other values might be learned and might be possible to be learned. On schedule, that's good. So, this term velomobility. And the use of the term has been a deliberate move to parallel the analysis of automobility as a system, to suggest that we need to think about cycling in systemic terms. And here and now, I'm further developing this to argue for a political analysis, to enable us to create an imaginative space, to imagine, to create visions, to envision, perhaps, mobility after the car, to look at post-car futures. Again, in Kingsley and Ari's book, this is used in terms of scenario building or speculative design. What I want to do in the latter section of this presentation is to think about what a political project of velomobility might look like. This means confronting automobility's role as a primary means for the reproduction of carbon capital. We could take the individual elements of the system of automobility and respond by offering an alternative to each in turn. Be very logical, but to do so would be to fall into the trap of simply creating a new alternative system that could easily be interpreted in a similarly hegemonic way. The point of an anti-hegemonic critique is not that it desires to replace one dominant power by another, but that it seeks to undermine the institution of relations that create those patterns of domination in the first place. Consequently, velomobility is applying a post-developmental imaginary to mobility. It seeks not to see how one system can replace another, but to acknowledge the multiple possibilities of organizing the movement of goods and services differently, otherwise, and other ways. In this endeavor, it also starts from not trying to plan a perfect solution, create an all-encompassing theory of future mobility. Aware of the difficulty of imagining alternatives from within the belly of the beast, as it were, One clue to possible shapes of alternatives is to look at the activities and solutions of those who survive and thrive in this regime of automobility whilst not driving. So the first question to ask in terms of mobility interventions is, what are mobility practices actually for? Are they for the satisfaction of needs up to a threshold of sustainability with relations of fair distribution? Or are they designed to accrue surpluses that reproduce privilege and reinforce inequalities? What might desirable mobility look like if the maximization of movement and increasing speed and distance are decentered? Why indeed do we need to constantly get away from where we are? What's gone wrong with our planning that we no longer have access to the resources for social and cultural reproduction in our given locations? So as we begin to talk about sufficiency, we also need to note that the ability to thrive and to be satisfied within limits is culturally shaped, not a matter of individual preparedness. This means that it might be more accurate to talk about velomobilities as in the plural, as they take different forms depending on the cultural resources available. And to borrow the title of a recent article of mine, velomobilities are to degrowth as automobility is to growth. That's the starting point for thinking. They comprise, yes, a system approach to degrowth mobility and a political imaginary that begins, I hope, to enable us to think differently. They're not divorced from the world of practical application, but because they form a critical tool for us to be able to think about what it is we're doing in planning intervention and who it's for all the time. And because it's a systematic analysis and it's focusing on human scale mobility, it defuses the bikes versus e-bikes versus scooters versus e-mobilities discussions and arguments, because it emphasizes above all, it's the human scale that's important, not the source of energy for the vehicle. So we're beginning to kind of assemble a set of questions that thinking in this manner can align us to, and as a response to to do more than just raising questions all the time, which is kind of very easy cop out. I want to bring up some propositions on velomobility, far from exhaustive, but an indicative of a number of ways of thinking. So I've got out of track with me slides, apologies. So here's 4, and there could be a lot more. It's a decolonizing project. It doesn't propose a universal solution. Universalized solutions are inevitably colonial. It aims to constantly destabilize the legacy of power in mobility relations, to challenge the sequestration of resources by those with high mobility capital already. I would say it can fruitfully be understood and explored as an eco-feminist project, to critically examine and reject the masculinizing discourses of mobility that value speed, that value power, that value the domination and mastery of space. It instead concerns itself with the way that these impact upon the more than human world and of those rendered lesser as humans in terms of those social relations. It interpolates an ethic of care into mobility priorities. I'm suggesting, and I've just wiped this out from the slide in my last edit, apologies. It suggests it as an abolitionist project. So in common with other abolitionist projects, it's not just about getting rid of the object of abolition. So prison abolition is not just about getting rid of prisons. Abolition Velomobility as an abolitionist project is not just about getting rid of cars. Rather, it's about building slowly building situations where the object of critique, the object of abolition, is neither needed nor relevant, where it ceases to be a meaningful solution to the problems. So in that, it's also a prefigurative utopian project. It works through the formation of imaginative spaces, virtual and temporary realities, experimental spaces of practice. It explores possibilities while unafraid of failure. Experiments can and need to be carried out. Whether something works or not is actually irrelevant to that process of discovery. Inspiration can be taken from the situations and explorations, but not as a kind of, well, this worked and therefore iteratively we need to change in a particular direction. That's a kind of, explorations and examples don't serve as blueprints, but sources of illumination in which to cast light on, in order to find one's own way, given the relevance of one's own situation. Because each situation we try and shift is new and different. And it's, as I've mentioned before, an anti-capitalist project, consistently aware of the ways in which mobility expansion has been intimately connected with the expansion of capital. It prioritizes movement for human interaction over that for surplus production. In trying to break the high energy mobility nexus, it seeks to open spaces to rethink the energies required for the movement of people, goods, and services in a post-growth, degrowth economics. It's going to take a lot of exploration. It's going to take a lot of experiment. But one hopeful sign and way of thinking about this is thinking about the limits that cycling can't do this. Cycling can't provide all these. So if all the previous discussions become a little abstract, let's turn ourselves back to the everyday practices as they're currently inserted into systems dominated by automobility. In this context, we might identify the accusations that cycling is only good for certain things and reverse that critical gaze. If we have admittedly unsustainable mobility systems at present, why are the limits of cycling and of shared public transport, for example, the things that it can't do and that driving can do in that normative framing? Why are those limits understood as problematic? Perhaps we can rethink them as virtues. That it forces us to, human scale travel forces us to be interactive, to be interrelational. It forces us to confront other persons. It forces us to confront the environments that we live in. And that's both built environments and the natural environments or the natural forces. It requires us to not take mobility for granted. We have to think about the seasonality of travel, the seasonality of possibility. It requires us to be flexible, to design flexibility into our everyday life and work programs. It's self-limiting. It's self-limiting in distance, in energy. And that, of course, has to be a key to understanding sufficiency. If we understand that the link between sufficiency and recognizing limits, then I think we're definitely part of the way there in being able to envision more sustainable systems. And it challenges, as I've mentioned previously, the sequestration of resources, the energy resources, the spatial planning resources that are available. So let's just bring this to some conclusions. You were probably enticed into listening to this because you thought I was going to talk about cycling as it currently can be recognized, perhaps gain insights into practical means to get a bit more cycling, connect it with instructions on how to achieve degrowth. Sorry if I've disappointed you. What I've tried to do instead is present a critical analysis that explores this linkage between thinking through the logical political connections of cycling promotion and the desire for less destructive ways of being in the world, with a starting point of the insights gained from actual practices. But go further than just reflecting on action. We need, as I've argued, to properly theorize those actions. Praxis forms from the unity of practice and theory, but it's all too easy to get lost and put the emphasis on the activity, become solipsistic, project from reaction to immediate personal circumstance, rather than applying the tools of critical analysis that academia rightly demands. I've veered off into vélomobility as the application of post-developmental thinking to mobility in an attempt to destabilize this all too easy equation of progressive politics that achieves its end through an additive and cumulative process, going back to the questioning and using the mobilities approach. Degrowth needs to be more than a convenient slogan in the face of destructive and exploitative practices. I hope that this experiment in thought provides a way of looking afresh at the problems of sustainable transport development. So thank you. 45 minutes.
Good timing. Very good timing here. 1 minute past 4. Great. All right, then thank you so much for your speech, Peter. All right, so then do we have any questions from Ralph, maybe?
Yeah, thanks so much for this great talk. I was just wondering, I mean, can you talk about imaginaries of cycling without thinking also of, so to say, I don't know how to call it, complementary mobility systems? And you need at least, talk about public transport, or, if one, and does this then not to some extent lead away again from the degrowth perspective, or how does this fit together?
Yeah. I speak as someone who knows about the cycling stuff. I know sufficient about public transport, and yes, cycling it's just one element. And I mentioned in the abstract and very, very briefly the whole thing about e-mobilities as well. And so I'm not looking at a cycling oriented. The temptation is always to kind of imagine the alternatives as what's left after the removal of the object of critique. And of course, it's just chaos. There's a void. What are we going to put in its place? And so actually, yeah, being able to think about all of these and saying, okay, so if we are the hypermobile, and if our economies depend on this hypermobility and the reproduction of hypermobility for the reproduction of capital and capital in its accumulative form, then how do those bits fit together? So it's that systems analysis of mobility systems, of which cycling is just one little bit. I just haven't found a better word than vélomobilities to kind of do this. I like the vélomobilities because actually the velo, it is speedy. It is not just saying we need to slow everything down. I love the kind of slow mobilities approach, but the language doesn't work for me because it's physically it's not quite right. It's not about the speed itself. It's about the conceptualization. And I know that's what slow mobilities is getting at. But yeah, so I'm trying to use this term to open it up. It might not be the right term, but if anybody can come up with a better one, I'll buy it.
Yeah, I think we have one question from the audience online.
Yes,
I'm
just wondering whether We can even.
We can, yeah, we can try to maybe connect them with.
Yeah.
Just 1 second here. Let's see.
Ida, do you want to ask a question live?
Ida,
Peter.
that are
you hear me?
online, do you want to say something out loud?
Yes, I'm trying to say something. Hi, Peter.
Just unmute and then.
I have unmuted, I think.
But wait, otherwise I'll just ask.
Okay, maybe we will ask you.
Yes, this didn't work with the loudspeakers here, so I'll ask the question from Ida Sabelis, who said, "Dear Peter, could you elaborate a little more on the decolonizing quality and its necessity of velomobility? And how will you combine velomobility with active mobility? Would that help in reconciling the different developments in cycle studies at the moment?"
The latter end of that first, reconciling it with active mobility is very, very probably. My only concern is that locally I'm dealing with a situation where active mobilities as a packaged political agenda has been rather hijacked into a very, very small box. And so I'm not using that because at home, certainly, because it falls into a particular way. And because the active mobilities has not connected with that wider agenda. Yes, it's about it brings in the social equalities, but it doesn't address the degrowth agenda, and it doesn't address the decolonial agenda, which is why I want to kind of come back to that. So that the whole process of kind of thinking about how mobilities colonize space, they colonize the imagination, they take over and determine the course of thinking. So going back to that post-development analysis where this I draw this connection to, it's the way that the form of hegemony of high energy, high speed, high energy mobility systems demand only one logical future that draws everybody together. The development process is a form of neocolonialism that determines a final outcome and the only desirable outcome for all the others. So by just pushing the idea that this has to be about decolonization, it also has to be about plural futures and that look different and feel different and take different form according to the localities, to the resources, to the needs of any given area. So I think that's what I'm trying to indicate by talking about a decolonial politics of velomobility, that it opens up a plurality of indications. And as I say, the active mobility I'm slightly wary of using because it doesn't. It's not at home. It's not encouraging as a way of thinking about plural futures. It's all or nothing. So it may be local politics.
Thank you very much. And I don't know if this question makes sense, but by the way, I really appreciate your way to make the discourse of velomobility situated and framed in order to avoid to make it instrumental to the discourse of growth. So in order to be critical, you have to situate and frame this discourse as you made in the degrowth. I'm thinking about the velomobility and the imaginary of the future you you outlined in the talk, I was thinking about which are the steps to get there. And I was thinking about the relationship between the idea of mobility, velomobility, and the idea of transition. So does it make sense to you to think about velomobility and mobility as you in terms of transitions, in terms of, or this is something that is instrumental to grow itself?
Again, transitions. Yes, transitions makes a huge, thinking in terms of transitions makes a huge amount of sense. But again, where are we talking about? What we've got to be very careful, I think, about how the language of transitions has been taken over, colonized, I dare say, by certain kind of political moves. That it's very easy to think in terms of transition to start to fall back into a very social statics way of thinking about change. We have situation A, we have situation B. How do we get from there to there? And again, you know, the UK example, much of the talk about transition is really based in that static model rather than the transitions work that I know that you're doing, which is much more based on understanding flux and understanding processes of constant shifting. So I'm always reluctant to talk about steps and stages, because it's kind of like, where's the pathway and where have you got to get to? Well, I don't know where you've got to get to. And one of the things about a de-instrumentalized image of change is having the faith and the confidence and building the trust to say, we might not know what the final outcome is. We won't know what the final outcome is. We don't know quite where we're going, because one of the issues with destabilizing the climate is we don't know what it's kind of where we're going with this. We've put enough carbon dioxide in that we don't know what effect that's going to have. We can model it, but that increase is not just, we've got, how many parts per million are we on at the moment? Yeah, 420. It's not going to be 420 next year. And in a decade's time, which is going to add further instabilities. So there's a sense in which that idea of plotting stages and steps towards an outcome, I think we need to be politically bolder and say, okay, we know the direction of travel, and we know what is going to be desirable this year, what might be desirable next year, and actually being able to step forward and step out without that kind of final vision in place, which, if that's what you can do with transitions thinking in its current form, brilliant. I'm not up to verse on where it's going at the moment, I confess. But it's that being able to set out without a destination. I was reading, if I can give a parallel, I was reading something the other day, the difference between two traditions of pilgrimage. One in which the kind of the classic, we've got the destination, we are going to go to Santiago or wherever it is, and the other, the more Eastern way of thinking, we set out on a journey, and it takes us wherever we need to be, but we're on the journey. That's the really important thing. And I think there's a kind of sense in the uncertainty and unpredictability and what Rosa's work on the uncontrollability, we actually don't have a kind of key grasp of being able to have that mastery, and it's another one of those words that might allow us to kind of have the confidence to map out, this is the step. I can tell you the next 5 steps I'm going to take in my journeying, but I don't know where that's going to end up. Because if we take that mobilities model, by the time I've figured out where the destination is, it's already moved. So I think, if we can do that with transitions thinking and get away from the staging, and the social statics motion of change, I think that helps. And it's why I wanted to put mobilities into this in how we think about the notion of change. It's one of the big areas of mobilities that I think has been under-theorized and underdeveloped in mobilities thinking. Its implications for modeling change. Mimi thinks likewise.
Okay, then we actually have quite a few questions online also, but I'll start with one and then we can see whether there are other questions here. So one attendee says, thanks so much, Peter. Really appreciate your work. I'm curious about long-term strategies for working with and implementing cycling and post-growth strategies in our small rural town in northern Michigan, USA. Other than trying to start conversations and lead by example, getting involved in planning and zoning boards seems like a potential way in. That seems like a world where there'd be a wealth of wisdom from others' experience. Do you have any recommendations, whether books or training possibly that might be helpful or for beginners in that civic world?
The first answer is that absolutely brilliant for getting involved in that. It's a horrible, long, slow slog. Having been through that process, but there are fantastic networks of that I'm sure you may be connected with that have involvement in those processes. The difficulties of working. Well, in Michigan, you're going to be working within a straight state structure, within your local authority. So how and what those moves look like will depend on the internal political structures that you're dealing with. But there are some elements of the processes, the physical engineering of space that are actually not it's like planetary chemistry, atmospheric chemistry, to go back to that example. That's a fixed, no matter how much we theorize, 420 parts per million is 420 parts per million, and it has this effect, and 425 has this effect. So those are fixed. The actual engineering and practices and what you do to design good quality facilities that you're not going to have to rebuild in 5 years' time or 10 years' time is really important. Build for the vehicles that aren't there yet. Don't build cycling. Don't plan cycling ghettos. It's the one thing that German towns are really, really struggling with at the moment, because they have good infrastructure built for very few travelers 30 years ago, and trying to suddenly kind of realize that you've got more travelers than the capacity. You've got to move the lanes elsewhere. So it's a much bigger job than if they were just kind of designing in for the moment. So there are national strategies. There are some really good things in the US. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but certainly the reports from the VeloCity conference is one way of accessing people who are going through planning and campaigning processes that are closer to your experiences. I wouldn't recommend I would recommend my cycling activism book, is only if you wanted to look at the big picture. It's quite but it won't give you any examples of any useful examples of planning or how to do things or how not to do things.
Good. Then I'll just move on. So Vera says, love the idea of turning limits into virtues. Unfortunately, it's quite far from dominant culture. Any ideas on how to grow seeds from this new imaginary, starting with pedagogies of mobility, maybe?
Okay. I'd add to that imagery of seeds, because seeds are the way that we think about creating change through institutions. We plant a seed, it flourishes, and it grows into whatever it's going to grow into. There's also bubbles. That one of the things that it's just a different metaphor. So that if you think about bubbles, they appear, bubbles in a drink. They appear and they disappear. And they're small and they're fleeting. They're evanescent. They come, they go, they leave no lasting trace behind them. But their very presence in the medium that they're in transforms it. Yeah. Coke without bubbles in Coke. Milk with bubbles in it is definitely not milk. And please don't try it. When I was in the restaurant, we did it wrong. But the bubbles themselves, even though they appear to be kind of nothing, gone, they actually transform the material. So when we're thinking about those processes of change and, oh, look, well, it didn't last, it doesn't matter. It may be that the constant reiteration of these different experiments that just, we feel disappointed, we feel bereft because they don't last, they don't create an institution, but they may be the bubbles that change the very culture. And if we think about the way that social movements have acted to create social change, it's not necessarily by institutions. It may be because they are just constantly bubbling, and it becomes absurd to think of the way that change has become. It's happened in the UK. The best example is with the changes in attitudes about LGBTQ rights, that they haven't come from the formation of big institutions. It's just been a series of momentary bubbles that have changed the entire culture into one that is tolerant in a way that I couldn't have imagined when I was growing up. So I would say, yes, try and set seeds, but don't worry if it's it appears and it disappears. It's also not in your control. You can do what you can do, and you do it with joy, because if it's not fun, nobody else will want to come and do it. So I'd say that would be the way to think about it. Actually, sometimes it's not seeds, sometimes it is just bubbles. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, fine. Yeah, I think so. Should I go on? Bart is asking, as you say, the benefits of automobility flow to a small global elite, while the costs are borne by everyone. But in Western Europe and North America, that small elite includes much or most of the population and nearly all of the political leadership. Given that reality, where would you anticipate an effective movement towards velomobility and mobility sufficiency is most likely to arise?
I think probably it arises through not talking about bikes. Which is why I want to tie these two together. Although everybody knows that I talk about bikes, this thinking about degrowth, I think that's where the edge is. Recognizing that, okay, so it's the bigger problem of sustainability and sustainable transport is part of a bigger of this wider conception of unsustainable systems that I take heart from that research paper and the conference on Beyond Growth. You know, any institution that has a long-term outlook and needs to have a long-term outlook is beginning to have to think about, you know, where is it going, how is it getting there, and, you know, where is it going to be, not in 5 or 10 years time when, you know, this CEO retires, but as an institute, if the institution wants to last, it's got to have a 30, 40-year outlook. And therefore, I think that's where the real change is. And so I think in terms of transitions around there it is again, around car use, I think what we're seeing is the tying in, rather than trying to promote cycling, it's tying in with, okay, so this doesn't work and it's not going to work, and, you know, what we're going to achieve by switching to large e-vehicles, which were even bigger and heavier than the cars they were replacing, damn it, is that, you know, we are just going to have smogless congestion and even higher levels of pollution from tire and brake degradation, because we've got bigger, heavier vehicles. Therefore, that ain't going to work. And so if we are going to have cities as places that people want to live in and can live in without suffocating, those are the elements that are subject to change and requiring change, and that city authorities who don't want to be seen to leave negative legacies are going to do. Cycling comes in on the back of that, but you don't start by asking them to cycle. You start with saying, okay, you've got a problem. Okay, how do we deal with that? Oh, by the way, there's a solution.
Then Gavin, a colleague of us here at TMT, asks, can you further elaborate on your understanding or the argument on how cycling enables an ethics of care? Is it an ethics of care, or a more caring, conscious mobility, user aware of others, humans, species, the environment?
Okay, so the first thing, I'd go back to that point that the relationship is not determinate. It doesn't come out. What traveling, not in a tin box, if I can just very loosely put it like that way, and tin box cars and buses, requires you to, it forces you into confrontation with the seasons, with the world outside. You are not protected, you are not enclosed. And so therefore, there is a certain relationship. Now, without relationship, you can't have care. Well, care demands a certain relationship between carer and the object of care. Otherwise, it's just patronizing and colonial. So, as I say, it's not determinate, but it is required. Public transport, throwing that into it, forces you into into confrontation with other persons. You are in an enclosed space with strangers, and therefore you have to think about how your conduct affects them as much as you think about how their conduct affects you. So there is a beginning of an understanding. It provides things that can be developed into an understanding, but that relationship between developing an ethic of care and the resources needed to develop an ethic of care is not automatic, which is why it is a political challenge. It's a practical challenge to develop the narratives that link the experience, the practice, with the politics and the ethics. So that interrelationship is where the kind of agency comes in making, it's not about making the change, it's about in understanding how those two things interact, in that an ethic that depends on practice is related to practice, but it needs theorizing. And so I think it's that, if it makes sense, that's where I would look for that interface between just doing and using the doing to develop something else. It doesn't, as I say, it doesn't come automatically. It's got to be an act of political will and a political agency. And that's where you have the role for political and institutional leaderships. This is the role that whether it's a politician or whether it's a university governance, needs to step in and say, okay, so what's going on here? What are we doing by encouraging people to do this? Have we thought about where these might go further? And actually develop those narratives, develop those stories, enable us to do it. Yeah.
Yes, we have two more questions actually here online. So, three. Simon is asking a question related to everyday practices. So the question goes, cycling is anchored by a material object, the bike. Mm-hmm. Prefiguring a cycling culture in a degrowth world must surely involve rolling out practical things like repair, riding skill, fighting crap, transport infrastructure, and the weather, and finding parts occasionally. How does velomobility address these real everyday challenges? Theorizing of velomobility is surely tricky without these everyday practices and examples included.
Yeah, so we're back in the realms of social practice theory. I think very, very strongly here that we have competencies, we have the materials, and we have the meanings. And the materials, I must say, as you point out, they're often very, very lacking. They're often quite limited. So it's an entrepreneurial challenge to insert those very materials of practice. I can be unashamedly I don't know what the word is, supportive of kind of entrepreneurial intervention. You know, this is not about capital accumulation. Making a living is making a living. You got to pay your rent. For a number of years, I actually made a living by repairing bikes, by selling things that bike shops as a capitalist formation weren't interested in doing. You know, in the 1990s, did they sell trailers? Did they sell attachments for doing anything practical? No, sir. So those had to be all the work on advanced cycle design over the past pretty much 50 years, from small wheels to folding machines to suspension units, has all come from outside the industry. So there is a space for creative activism by cycling technologies and repairs have been transformed, not by kind of hoping that an industry that is supposed to provide bike mobility will do anything. It never has, and I don't think it ever will do. It's come by those who want to see something done, making it happen. And so I think there is an opportunity. The rise of bike kitchens as ways has been absolutely essential to the spread of and practicalities of repair. The spread of enthusiasts who kind of try building things has been equally essential to the development of bicycle technologies for doing different purposes, for going further or in the same time. or for being more comfortable, or for carrying more luggage. Any of those has all come from people just getting out and doing it. So I think there's actually a great opportunity for creative ways of engagement that are not simply about cornering a market or accumulation, but actually just the everyday business of making a living. So I think there is certainly something there, and that means that we do need more repair options. I'm actually coming here to Linköping. I've been amazed about how you can turn most corners and there's someone you can get a repair from. It's quite extraordinary. I live in a town with one bike shop. It's just it's really bizarre, and it's town of the same size. So yeah, there are opportunities there, but I think don't look to someone else to do it for us. We've got to do it ourselves.
Good. I'll continue. Yes, one further question, and there is a longer comment, but everybody online can read it, and will give it to you afterwards. So I don't think it makes sense to read the whole comment, the other one. But the question is thoughts on reducing inertia that suppresses cycle use. I only shop at supermarkets where I can wheel the bike in and into the store and load it directly from the till. Far faster and lower inertia than having exposed bike racks in the corner of a car park furthest from the entrance. So any thoughts about reducing inertia?
Yeah. Shopping and cycling, practical everyday use. Well, it's got to be about there is always compromise and there is always being sensitive, and showing how certain things can be done is often I find is often a really useful way. The confrontation sometimes works, but it's rarely my favorite technique, although it used to be. So yeah, we have to figure out what is the appropriate solution for those people, and it's always going to be built on this relationship. It's never going to be a universal solution. It's got to be about how are you building a relationship with those from whom you're buying your goods, for example. What are the processes by which you can sounds a bit patronizing, but educate them as to what the possibilities are, what the requirements are. I find if I've got a load, I tend to use a trailer, and therefore, actually I need to take either to have a trailer I can wheel in, which is a possibility, or just actually have shopping bags in a trailer that I can put outside. Because that would be like trying to drive into the store because it's a big thing, and then there's me bike, and then there's me. So actually kind of thinking about that care towards others, that's not a solution. There are compromise solutions to be made. So, but is there not a sensible parking space? And then that's got to be addressed. That's the letter. That's the excuse me, can I? Why isn't there a rack? No. Can I park my bike safely here? Because there isn't anywhere outside to do so. So those elements. So it's about finding out what's appropriate for the specifics of any given situation, I think, a part of that plural solutions.
Then we go. Here's one more questions, and then you can. Okay, so Isabel says you have accomplished a lot of research on cycling. Where would you like to see cycling research develop in the upcoming years, and which aspects still require more research attention?
Ooh, One of the huge privileges I had was being asked to help contribute and edit sections of that Routledge Companion to Cycling, which kind of gives some idea of the vast scope of possibility. From my own kind of egotistical perspective, I'd love to see more theorization, because I kind of feel that there's me and there's Cosmin and a couple of others, but it's I want someone to challenge our perspective, because we end up saying very, very similar things. There is a tendency to get I suppose I've been doing this 20 years. One of the things I see is a lot of enthusiasm that really focuses in on how do we achieve this change, and I would love to see a little bit more about thinking about the models of change, the assumptions of how change happens. So a deeper engagement with the theoretical perspectives behind social change, rather than just kind of how do we achieve this? Take a step back. So I think that's where I'd like to see it go. I'd love to see more conversation with the biophysical sciences, and an engagement of the biophysical sciences, not with just measuring what is done at the moment in the ways that people ride and with an emphasis on sports, but in terms of the broader how we might think about the biophysical impacts of different designs, for example. For the engineers, I'd like to see conversations open up between designers who are designing to meet specific needs, and some of the engineering knowledge on balance and stability that's out there, for example. So it's the intersections of different disciplinary areas, I think, is the most exciting space that I'd like to see more research going on.
Yeah, but we can take one more from online. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a short one till, and then Karin will have some concluding words of discussion also. But we are already slowly running out of time. So the question is from Alex: is change happening with e-bikes, and are they the new generation of cyclists entering our ranks?
Now there's a telling comment. Our ranks, but yes, I think e-bikes have been a bit of a game changer. They extend the possibility of cycling to a much broader range of people who don't have the physical capacity or the and some of them who don't think they have the physical capacity to cycle. They extend cycling life. Certainly, that was one of the very, very early observations in the rise of e-bikes. So I have absolutely nothing against e-bikes. I don't have one anymore, but that's a different story. No, I just gave up on it. Another 5 years, it'll be back. But yeah, they open it up, and there is a slight dilemma as we come to think about, where is our limit between an augmentation using e-power to equalize, perhaps it's easier to put it this way, to equalize our bodily capacities, and those that are, just purely motorization. So we're actually kind of creating a motor vehicle with an electric engine to do far more than is still human scale movement. And where that line lies, I'm entirely unsure about. I'm coming around to kind of like, well, it's a bit more than 30 kilometers an hour, but it's less than 40. But the speeds that a human being can move unassisted, anything up to that, what's a sprinter do? Well, it's 10 meters per second. Okay, so that's a sort of useful measure of human speeds. But yes, I think the e-bike is definitely part of that. And it's great to see how many more people it opens up to travel. That is about encounter and understanding that that as travelers, without a cage around us, we've got to take care of each other.
So, all right. So no more questions online now? Or okay. Then just one last question. I really like this theoretization, but also that it's still kind of close to what we actually can imagine, like also maybe being kind of at least attached to politics, I think. But one question that I had a little bit in relation to this comment about the car being mostly for the elite and that are gaining from that while all others are paying. So I mean, if we see at least here in Sweden, if we would see from a like more populist political angle, that would be the cyclist, right? Like the urban man, white collar, middle class person taking their very expensive bike or e-bike to work, kind of. And how, I mean, first of all, how should we tackle that perception? But also, like, can we as, I don't know,
people who use bikes.
Yes. How can we also maybe benefit from that? Because that is a group that can kind of help us do something about that. Or how should we?
But the first is that I would go really, really big on getting some data, because riding around this town for the past month, I've seen two people who I would call expensive or elite males on expensive bikes, plus the three women who I saw out the other day. Whereas the majority of people are just young, old, all sorts, predominantly women, who are actually using the bike as everyday use. They don't appear on most statistics because most people are interested in long journeys rather than just measuring what people do in mundane behavior. Even when you have that, when there is a reality to an elite group of males who already have political power and lots of disposable money, probably not here, but I have seen it elsewhere, where you mobilize their desires for even greater leisure to say, okay, so that means we need a facility for this. And you design something for everyday short distance use that happens to coincide with their desires, but you're actually rolling it out in full consciousness that what it's actually about is just the poor people's everyday mobility. So I think it's part of it is actually just data. Who is using it? Who is not using it? Why are they using it, not using it? What sort of infrastructure does that need? Does that require? And yes, the fit, able-bodied who can look after themselves can look after themselves. But when they have a voice, then you can use a collective that is it's a kind of useful fiction to say cyclist. When it becomes a non-useful fiction, drop it immediately. But and again, it comes back to that earlier point of just thinking, who is your audience? Who are you trying to help? We've got to be clever political operators. We've got to accept that a lot of this is about manipulation of those who have the money and how those who have the investment regimes. Yes, as I said, if economic growth is the language that's being talked, then talk it. But that doesn't mean that that's where I actually want to push it. I think we have to be canny operators as well as just having visions and dreams.
Well, I think that is a good finishing words, right? So thank you so much, Peter. And
Welcome.
thank you for all of you online and for all of you here. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been really good.